What's driving down the number of terrorist attacks? The U.S. State Department argues the falls due to the near defeat of armed groups such as ISIL. At the same time, Americans again single out Iran as the leading state sponsor of continuing attacks. So what now for the so-called global war on terror? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. A fall by almost a quarter in the number of attacks by armed groups worldwide last year. That's one of the conclusions of the US State Department's latest annual survey of global terrorism. But Iran won't welcome another of the survey's highlights. The Americans singling out the Iranians as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. The Iranians are accused of intensifying many conflicts, especially in Afghanistan, Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon and Yemen, and continued backing for militias such as Hezbollah. The US government says Hezbollah fighters based in Lebanon have gone from strength to strength, emboldened by their battlefield experience in Syria. And the Americans accuse Iran of undermining legitimate governments and American interests in the Middle East. The report details a worsening of war in Afghanistan and coordinated attacks by the Taliban and its affiliated Haqqani network. Some were launched from Pakistan, which provoked the US to recently cut $300 million in security aid. Let's take a look at the report's other findings. The US State Department says there were about 8,500 what it calls terrorist attacks around the world last year. The attacks killed 18,700 people. The Americans attribute the 23% year-on-year fall in the number of deaths to victories against ISIL and improved security in Iraq. Despite that, ISIL remains active and carried out attacks in 20 countries last year. More than half of all attacks by armed groups, including ISIL, al-qaeda and the Taliban, were in just 5 countries: Afghanistan, India, Iraq, Pakistan and the Philippines. The 15-month-long Saudi-led dispute with Qatar isn't helping cooperation in the Gulf, but the US is trying to encourage discussion of Iran's influence in the Arab world. The White House supported a high-level meeting of military officers from the Gulf Cooperation Council in Kuwait this month. But Qatar has been under a Saudi-led blockade since June 2017. Qatari leaders deny accusations of funding terrorism and too close a relationship with Iran. Qatar is the only GCC member to have signed a bilateral agreement with the United States to combat terrorist financing. Let's bring in our panelists. Joining us from Doha, Ibrahim Fraihat, Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution, Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. In Tehran, Hamid Musawi, Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran. And from Washington, D.C., Hilary Mann-Leverett, former U.S. State Department official and CEO of the political risk consultancy Stratega. Welcome to the program. Ibrahim, when the report talks about the decline in attacks and casualties from terrorist groups, is that an indication that groups, for example, like ISIL and al-qaeda have lost the fight?
First of all, the report talks about a reduction in number of attacks by ISIS by about 23% compared to last year. So it's very obvious that the removal of ISIS from Mosul and Raqqa has impacted the numbers of attacks that launched by ISIS this year. However, this leaves us with 2 major questions. One is that whether these numbers are sustainable, whether they are continuing, or they're going to continue. Because what could happen is that ISIS is, after the removal from Mosul and Raqqa, they're probably repositioning themselves, like what happened in al-qaeda, with al-qaeda back in 2003. That the removal of al-qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan was followed by some sort of quietness in terms of activities. But later, actually, we saw that more of al-Qaeda repositioning itself and resuming its activities. And the other important major thing that we have to keep in mind is that removing an organization, the governance structure of an organization from two cities, Mosul and Raqqa, does not in any way mean that the end of the phenomenon. And here I'm talking about terrorism as a phenomenon that has been actually in the region for a long time. So fighting ISIS is something, and violent extremism is totally separate thing.
Okay.
So in my view, I don't think this suggests any major conclusions for the phenomenon itself, and it doesn't mean that while ISIS could probably lose the battle, but violent extremism
will continue. Hamid, the Iranian mission of the United Nations said that basically the statement of the survey, the annual report by the State Department, ignores the fact that Iran has played a crucial role in the fight against ISIL, particularly in places like Iraq and Syria. Do the Iranians feel somehow that they are being singled out for a political reason?
Yes, I mean, this is a contradiction in the report. On the one hand, the report says that the number of attacks have decreased by 23% compared to last year because of ISIL's defeat. Yet we have to ask who has been the primary player in defeating ISIL. Iran has played a major role in helping the Iraqi and Syrian governments in defeating ISIL. And actually, Iran has lost several thousand soldiers in this regard. In comparison, the United States was not willing to put boots on the ground. They only conducted air campaigns. And we have to remember that the air campaigns actually came very late in the game. Actually, a 2016 audio leak by John Kerry, who was then the Secretary of State, revealed that the US had actually allowed ISIL to grow in order to put pressure on Assad. So I think the United States is actually in no position to accuse Iran of terrorism in the region.
Hillary, this is a complex landscape. I mean, ISIL could have been widely defeated in places like Syria and Iraq, but they remain pretty much active in places like the Yemen or also North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the findings of the report itself could be misleading to the international audience in one way or another.
Yes, and I mean, the entire reason the United States has these terrorism reports is a political one. These reports started in 1979 with Iran as a charter member of this of what we call these state sponsors of terrorism. And the reason was that President Carter back in the 1970s started to focus more on human rights in countries and had mandated the State Department to produce reports on human rights in countries. Those focused uncomfortably on American allies, particularly on Israel and Saudi Arabia. Their friends, their lobbyists here in Washington needed to have an answer to that, and that they pushed for these terrorism reports. And since 1979, these terrorism reports have focused, yes, on some incidents of terrorism around the world, what I think most analysts objectively would refer to terrorism, but they have also focused very much in a political way on those groups and countries the United States doesn't like. And that ranges not just from a country like Iran, but also to the Nelson Mandela's ANC in South Africa, for example. They were blasted in these terrorism reports early on. And some of the political parties in Iraq that the United States works with today, like the Dawa Party, was a listed organization for terrorism. So there is very much a political motivation, which muddies the waters in terms of what's actually happening in terms of incidents and steps to prevent terrorist incidents.
Ibrahim, Hillary was talking about the political reasons behind the annual report. Did it come to you as a surprise when Iran was singled out in the report as sort of somehow the state leading sponsor of terrorism in the world?
Well, as a regional analyst in politics of the region here, it was not in any way surprising to me, because I totally agree with my colleague from Washington that the entire philosophy and purpose of this report is highly politicized, and it's used in an extremely selective way, and in particular never mentions Israel, as my colleague also said. So Iran, in terms of my understanding of the U.S. foreign policy, since the Riyadh summit back in May 2017, where the whole alliance, was forged between the Trump administration, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and to a large extent Israel, the center of this alliance was Iran, and how to counter Iran and how to put an end to the Iranians' influence and expansion of what they say in the region. So if you follow the U.S. policy from that moment until now, whether it's the cancellation of the nuclear deal, whether it is the harsh sanctions that were imposed recently on Iran. So this just one additional step in that overall policy in order to increase the pressure on Iran and to single out Iran in terms of that. Because let's keep in mind on the issue on Iran here, because here we're talking about two different definitions, whether it's terrorism as ISIL or al-qaeda or something else. But the United States, what it's referring to here is in terms of Iran's relationship and support to the Houthis and Hezbollah and Iraq as well.
Okay. Hamid, to sum up the report, particularly when it comes to Iran, it talks about two things, about the near global reach of Iran, basically Iran as a destabilizing force in places like Yemen, Afghanistan, Bahrain, and also bringing to its terrorist activities the resources of a state. This is exactly the wording in the report. Is this an indication that we might see more confrontation between the Americans and the Iranians in the short term?
When we talk about destabilizing the region, we have to remember that this whole mess was created after the United States illegally invaded Iraq in 2003. And the instability actually spread in the region. And wherever the Americans have gone to in the past 2 decades have turned into disasters: Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, etc. Now, with regards to Iran, Iran actually publicly declares that it does support Hezbollah. However, Iran does not see Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Hezbollah does not carry terrorist attacks in European capitals or in the United States. It's a local resistance group fighting against Israel. If we declare every force that is fighting Israel as terrorists, then yes, it will be, but that's not how Iran sees it. Regarding confrontation between Iran and the United States, unfortunately, we are going down that path because every few days, the Trump administration is accusing Iran of something new. And I think this is part of a much larger campaign of trying to dehumanize the Iranian people as well as imposing sanctions on them.
Hillary, the Americans made it quite clear that they would like to ramp up sanctions against Iran, and they're trying to convince major allies to follow suit. This report, do you find it as an element that could further put more pressure on Western allies, particularly, to say, you know what, it's about time we follow the Americans in this particular path?
Yes, absolutely. Though there is an important debate or perhaps even war going on within the Trump administration between those that want to, I would say the key decision makers in the Trump administration are all very much either anti-Iran or Iran hawks, but in different and important ways. Someone, for example, like the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, is looking to build a case with terrorism data, like in this report, to build a case for regime change, to overthrow the government in Iran. That's what someone like National Security Advisor John Bolton is looking at. Someone like Secretary of State Pompeo, though, and perhaps even President Trump himself, is looking to build a case against Iran, including with terrorism data, like in this report, in order to put maximum pressure on Iran, to force Iran to sign a wide-ranging, broad treaty with the United States, as is their approach with North Korea. Because President Trump and Secretary Pompeo don't really care that much about the subtleties or the data involving terrorism or nuclear weapons or any of the other list of concerns the United States puts out there. So you have someone like Secretary Pompeo, maybe even Defense Secretary Mattis, and maybe even President Trump himself against these other players like like National Security Advisor John Bolton, who want to overthrow the Iranian government. They are both using this data for their own strategy strategies, and there's not one settled strategy yet within the U.S. government. It's very much a battle within the government, whether to use this data to force Iran into a negotiation for a deal with the United States, like it's doing with North Korea, or to use this data to build a case to literally overthrow the Iranian government.
Ibrahim, the key regional players in the region, some of them made it quite clear that they support the Americans in the push to counter what they describe to be an Iranian growing influence in the region. Is this a similar feeling among the key international players, particularly the EU?
No, of course not, because we have seen the divergence and the positions of the international community between the U.S., between the Trump administration and the Europeans. Though at the same time, we have to keep in mind that actually Europe and some other countries have failed to come up with a strategy to counter the American strategy in dealing with Iran. And all the attempts that were made, we haven't seen any of that. So I think this does not, though the rest of the world is taking a different position on this issue, I think that does not or is not minimizing the pressure coming from the United States and the escalation in the crisis that, again, the alliance that was forged after the Riyadh summit in May 2017, that is leading in this and continues to shape the politics of the region at this level.
Hamid, some of the accusations leveled against Iran in the report are similar to what we hear in the region, particularly about Iran. People say, many countries, you know them, they say basically Iran is spreading radical ideology in the region. Iran is providing significant help to the Houthis to undermine a legitimate government. Iran is trying to counter the Sunni presence in the Arab world with a new radical narrative. Isn't this an opportune moment for the Iranians to say, wait a second, isn't this the right time to start reaching out to our arch rivals in the region, particularly countries like Saudi Arabia?
Iran has actually indicated that it does want to improve relations with Saudi Arabia. However, in recent months, it has become very difficult because the Saudis have actually become very close to the Israelis, and they have actually become part of the Saudi, Emirati, Israeli effort to sanction Iran in the region. We have to remember that the sanctions on Iran are having a very important impact. I mean, right now it is even crucial drugs are hard to find within Iran. So when you see these hostile actions by the other side, you have to expect Iran to also get defensive. And I think Iran, we have to remember that it is responding to a very destabilizing and threatening regional environment. When the Trump administration decided to leave the nuclear accord 4 months ago, and by the way, the IAEA since then has confirmed that Iran is actually abiding by its side of the deal, even though the United States has left. So on the one hand, you're seeing all of these pressures building up on Iran, and I think it would be inappropriate for Iran to not respond in its own kind.
Hilary, the report expresses concerns about the ongoing crisis in the Gulf region, saying that this erodes all attempts to try to tackle regional security issues. You know the situation right now. There's absolutely no indication that we're going to see any political settlement. What's next for the Americans?
Well, that's one of the most fascinating, important parts of this report. I have almost never seen such a documented case in one of these U.S. terrorism reports, giving credit to, praising another country as it has done in this report with Qatar. It has documented very seriously, very substantively, all the steps that Qatar has done working with Washington, that Doha has done working with Washington to address almost every single one of Washington's concerns in the realm of terrorism, in the realm of security, of a range of issues in the Gulf. So I think it shows what a dramatic change, what a dramatic impact Qatar's foreign minister and defense minister had here in Washington after the May Riyadh summit, when things went so terribly, terribly wrong. Given that basis, it's still very much a political decision how Washington addresses the ongoing Saudi-led blockade of Qatar. But I think this report gives at least a substantive basis for those in Washington Washington to try to continue efforts to bring this more to a peaceful close, rather than just to take the side of the Saudis or their Emiratis, as was the initial inclination.
Ibrahim, ultimately, do you think that this is going to be the Americans stepping in, putting all their political leverage in the region and telling all the parties, you know what, you need to set aside your differences, come on board because your help is crucial at this particular moment? Or you think it's too late at this particular moment?
Well, first, let me agree again with my colleague from Washington. And I think from what we've seen in this report, I mean, this is considered, in my view, a breakthrough, that the United States is taking such a firm position, very clearly stated that Qatar has done such and such and such and such, all documented in a formal document, in collaboration and fighting and countering terrorism. This is unprecedented, because from also our understanding of how the United States manages its relations with its allies, is always trying to keep in the middle and try to keep good relations with both sides without really giving one party a clear position supporting one country, as they did in this report. However, with all the credit that is given to Qatar, now I don't think we should overestimate and overread what is the United States is going to do as a result, whether it's going to intervene and put an end to the Gulf crisis. I don't think so. However, what I think the United States is likely to do is that to bring the parties together on certain segments of its foreign policy, and that segment that's serving its interest and its foreign policy, but keeping the crisis intact. And this is why I'm saying this is also because just a week ago, the United States was able to bring the army chiefs of the GCC countries to a meeting in Kuwait in order to coordinate some efforts. So
that was the first time we saw leaders from the GCC meeting together, particularly
which
after
is to serve again only a segment of the U.S. foreign policy. But I don't think that, or it's still too early to see or to expect that the United States is going to intervene and put an end to the Gulf crisis.
Hamid, you can defeat terrorism militarily. I mean, but the problem is that the idea continues. And I'm not an historian, but many would tell you that terrorism thrives in areas that stifle discontent, where you don't have vibrant democracies, places like the Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and many places around the world. Do you think that this could further push many countries, including Iran, to start reaching out to key regional players to agree about political settlements that can endure and where democracy can thrive?
Yes, I mean, it's true that political instability leads to the rise of terrorism, but also when there is a power vacuum, for example, like what happened in Iraq after the 2003 invasion, leads to the thriving of terrorism. Now, right now, the situation has somewhat stabilized in countries such as Iraq and Syria. Nevertheless, when discontent is still there and when there is still a power vacuum, there is always the real possibility that terrorism might rise again. Now, in regards to Iraq, Iran has actually tried to cooperate with the Iraqi government on this regard. On the issue of Syria, there has been several rounds of talks between Iran, Turkey, and Russia. However, we still have to wait and see whether that will actually result in an actual political settlement. What we need in these kinds of regions are political settlements, of course.
Hamid Moussaoui, Ibrahim, Fraihat, Hillary, Man, Leverett, thank you very much indeed for your present program today. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.